The fifth generation of consoles, being the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Nintendo 64, was arguably the most important generation when it comes to pushing console hardware to its fullest. The leap from 2D to 3D was massive, and while most of the games from this generation haven't aged all that well, their impacts can still be seen to this day. In my book, this was the most revolutionary generation. The fifth generation allowed us to explore and mess around in 3D environments, but the sixth generation is the one that took the first step into modern gaming. There was a massive push for looking as realistic as they can be, and more games had voice acting, dynamic camera angles. These games were becoming much more cinematic. It wasn't about ranking up a high score, more so it was more trying to be like an interactive movie. Granted, games on the PlayStation like the Final Fantasy games and Metal Gear Solid did this well, and I do believe games like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask got the ball rolling. But it was during the sixth generation where developers took that ball and ran with it. The developers of Halo 2 came out and said straight up that they wanted this to feel more like a movie. Twilight Princess was often said to be on par with Hollywood motion pictures at the time, and Metal Gear Solid 2, I think that one speaks for itself. Trying to be more than just a video game is ambitious, but unfortunately, it's this kind of mindset that made games from this generation age horribly. Some would even argue more so than the games of the previous generation. Bad voice acting, dated visuals, stiff animations, bad writing. Now granted, some games I think have aged rather well with decent visuals, animation, voice acting, whatnot, but most of the games of this generation fell victim to time. Naturally, some people didn't like this new direction where developers were heading. They were saying that developers were completely missing the point on why we play games to begin with. Long gone were the days of the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. It seemed as if the days of good 2D games were over. Nah, I'm just fucking with ya. This lovely little handheld needs no introduction. Released in 2001, this was the most powerful handheld console to ever be released. The GBA was often considered to be a portable Super Nintendo, but frankly, the Super Nintendo can't even compare to what this baby has to offer. 16-bit? Man, please! This bad boy has nothing but beautiful 32-bit goodness. 2D games have never looked this good. Okay, fine, never looked this good on a handheld. I think that's fair to say, right? And it helps that the GBA had an incredible first year, releasing with games like Advance Wars, Golden Sun, Castlevania, Circle of the Moon, Wario Land 4, and we'd be getting much more in the future, having a library of over 1,000 games to choose from. And you want to know what else? Backwards compatibility was a thing, meaning that all your favorite Game Boy and Game Boy Color games were playable on the GBA, making that already impressive library even larger. And you want to know what's even better on top of all of this? No region locking. If a game looked interesting but it was never released in your country, you can still play it. You'd have to get over the language barrier, yes, but you could still play these games. And man, I remember when the 3DS came out back in like 2011 and it was region locked, people were not happy at all. It really makes you appreciate the little things. Granted, this sounds all well and good and everything, but this system was not without its faults. For one, there's only one speaker and the sound quality isn't exactly the greatest, yet for some reason, despite the limitations, developers thought it would be a good idea to put highly compressed voice clips in their games, and I noticed a lot with licensed games, but just take a listen to this gem. Did that sound good? Did you enjoy that? Because Lord knows I didn't. But even though the GBA sound chip wasn't that great, there were still some excellent sounding GBA games, and these are just some of my favorites. Secondly, well, just look at it. There's no back or front lit screen, so the picture is always dark. Frankly, if you're playing on this thing, then you're doing it wrong. There we go, that's an improvement. This is the GBA SP, featuring a clamp design which makes it easier to fit in your pocket, and it has a backlit screen. I know some people prefer the original, but to me, this just feels right. The screen is an improvement, but I feel we can do a little bit better. Oh, that is much better. For those of you not in the know, Nintendo released the SP model with the front-lit screen under the AGS 101 model. There's just two minor problems that I have with the SP model. For one, when you close the system, it doesn't go into sleep mode, meaning that the battery will dry after a while. Secondly, there's no headphone jack whatsoever. There is an attachment that you can get that lets you use the headphones, but if I'm honest, I never really needed it, so the lack of a headphone jack isn't really a deal breaker. By far, the biggest improvement that the SP model brings is the rechargeable battery. The original model required two AA batteries, and between my sister and I having our own consoles, we used up batteries like nothing else, so the SP's rechargeable battery was like a gift from God at the time. But the coolest way to play GBA games was on the GameCube's GBA adapter. Now go ahead and tell me about how the Super Game Boy was so much better, or how the input lag is unbearable. But this was like having a Switch before a Switch. And anyways, playing GBA games on a CRT with the Super Nintendo controller, that is one of the most weirdly nostalgic experiences for me. Speaking of the Super Nintendo, the GBA was known for having a number of Super Nintendo ports. That was a buttery smooth transition. I know, I'm proud of it. When I was a kid, I was always familiar with the Super Nintendo, but all I really had access to was Donkey Kong Country and Mario World. So with games like A Link to the Past, Yoshi's Island, Tales of Fantasia, even Super Mario 2 USA, I had no idea that these weren't GBA games first. You know, it kind of reminds me of a weird, funny story. Nothing to do with anything really, but I remember I was at the flea market this one time that I used to go to before they shut down. I remember seeing Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 on the GBA, and I thought to myself when I was a kid, I was like, wow, this game got a sequel on the GBA. Oh, that's so cool. Only to find out years later that, yeah, they were on the Super Nintendo first. Now, to put myself in the boots of those who grew up on the Super Nintendo games, it must have been crazy seeing a cartridge like this be shrunk down to this and portable. And then they just got smaller and smaller. Oh my god, these things are going to be microscopic in a few years. I know for some folks they prefer the SNES original to these games. They tend to have better sound quality, and the GBA ports, more often than not, had sprites that would take up a good chunk of the screen, and a lot of games, again, used compressed voice clips which sound like ass. And I get it, and maybe I'm just being nostalgic, but with games like A Link to the Past, I've always preferred playing it on the GBA. In some cases, namely with the numbered Final Fantasy ports, I think these are the way to play them. Granted, they don't look or sound as pretty as the PlayStation ports, but the GBA versions have much better load times and better localizations. There are also a handful of remakes on the GBA. The first two that come to mind are Metroid Zero Mission and Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. The former is often considered to be the single best Metroid game to date. But personally, my favorite entry has always been Fusion. It's incredibly difficult given how fragile that your new suit is, and the SAX is terrifying. This game does an excellent job of making you feel things and even telling a story through gameplay. Though this game absolutely does have its plot dumps, I can agree with that criticism. As for the latter, this is one of two Kirby games that I've ever played, the other being, well, Kirby's Adventure on the NES. And this game is a remake of Kirby's Adventure, so I'm behind on Kirby. I do apologize. Is Star Allies any good? I kind of want to pick that up. Anyways, with Nightmare in Dreamland, you're looking at a game with brand new sprites and art made from the ground up, better music, and even some new minigames. Once I played this version, it was so hard to go back to the original. And in the case of Metroid Zero Mission, I mean, is it even fair to say that this is a remake? Because this feels more like a reimagining than anything else. It controls much better, there's a map system that made it so I never got lost, cutscenes that flesh out the story. Now I understand why people consider this to be the best entry in the series, and in fairness, if this is a remake, it's probably the best remake that I've ever played, but I still prefer Metroid 4, don't at me. You know what's kind of weird about all of this though? Out of all the Super Nintendo ports, Nintendo didn't bring over Star Fox to the GBA. And I know what you're thinking, maybe that game would have been too advanced for the GBA to handle, but the GBA could absolutely handle 3D games. Look at Star X. Granted, it's not great, not even that good if I'm honest, but it is a decent proof of concept. This kind of game can absolutely work, you just have to have the right team behind it. Even Sega got into the habit of porting over some of their Genesis games as well, with games like Comic Zone, Phantasy Star 1 through 3, but not 4 for some reason. Always found that odd, and yeah, Phantasy Star 1 is a Master System game, I am aware, but even Shining Force. Now, this one went way over my head. I only discovered this port about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but this is my personal favorite way to play this game. Granted, the sprites are obnoxiously large, but it does have really nice redone artwork, and more chapters in the form of the epilogues that tells more of the story, and it even fleshes out some of the characters that join your party more so than the Genesis original. You know, it's always been weird seeing Sega Genesis on what people call the portable Super Nintendo. Makes me wonder if they ever put any Sonic games over. Oh no! So, while the Sonic 1 port was trash, we at least got the Sonic Advance trilogy. And I remember when I was gifted this game back in the day when I was a kid, I somehow read Advance as Adventure, and I thought to myself, yo, they got Sonic Adventure on this thing! Oh man, that's my jam! I wasn't very bright as a kid. Glad to see that nothing's changed. Either way, Sonic Advance is a great game that I played religiously back in the day, and even to this day, I consider this to be a strong follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, so this is kind of like my Sonic the Hedgehog 4. Now, oh blah blah blah, Sonic Mania, oh look at me, I got Classic Sonic, and you got Green Hill and Chemical Plant, and a bunch of other states that you've seen before, wow! Now, hear me out for a second. This game, before DLC was even a thing, had a new character and a new playstyle in the form of Amy Rose. It had new stages, new bosses, new music. I mean, even to this day, I still feel as if this is a strong follow-up to the Genesis classics. Now, if I'm honest, I do prefer the Genesis trilogy over Sonic Advance, but this is still an incredibly solid follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and even on its own, it is still a great platformer. Sonic Advance 2 was more of its own thing, rather than a callback to the Genesis. I know some people don't care for this one, given how the level design isn't as polished and how some of the bosses are complete bullshit, but I really do enjoy this one. I like the idea of running so fast that you just straight up break the sound barrier, leaving behind a trail of after images, and I also feel as if this game has the best soundtrack and sprite work in the entire trilogy. It looks, sounds, and plays smooth as butter. Now, admittedly, I was never a huge fan of Sonic Advance 3. I liked the idea of the partner system, but I was just never a fan of the hub worlds, and the level design didn't feel very good at all. It relied a bit too heavy on the trial and error aspect. Now, I know this game has its fans, but I could just never get into this one, unfortunately. But if you want to see a damn good review of Sonic Advance 3 where a guy actually praises the game, check out my buddy Jay over at Jay's Reviews. He made a really good review of this game, so, you know, check that out. But by far, the weirdest thing about all of this is that, well, just to put it in perspective, we got 3 brand spanking new 2D Sonic games. We even got a weird-ass looking Sonic fighting game. I don't know how that is, so don't ask me. But we got no new 2D Mario games. Now, we got a kart racer, an RPG, a Mario Party, I guess, but if you were starving for a new 2D Mario platformer, then you were shit out of luck. The best you got were the Super Mario Advance games, which were the ports of the Super Nintendo's All-Star Pack games, and Yoshi's Island. On the flip side, if you were a fan of 2D platformers, then there was still so much for you to choose from. Wario Land 4 is an incredible 2D platformer with tight controls, great visuals, great music, and personality to boot. Wario is so expressive, and the level design and level themes are incredibly unique. It might not scratch that Mario itch that a lot of Nintendo fans had, but as its own thing, this is one of the most identifiable games on the GBA. But for me, my personal favorite 2D platformer is a little game called Drill Dozer, made by Game Freak. Yes, that Game Freak. This has some of the most creative level design in any 2D platformer that I've ever played. The whole game revolves around you and your drill, and the designers planned out levels that fleshes out the core gameplay mechanic to its fullest potential. Backed by excellent bosses, great artwork, a strong soundtrack, and some of the most expressive sprites that you'll find on the GBA, there's no question, this is easily one of the best GBA games on the market, and it's one of my personal all-time favorites. Hell, just look at the cartridge. First of all, it's pink, and pink is dope, and secondly, this cartridge has a built-in rumble pack, so every time that you use your drill, the GBA itself will vibrate. Now, granted, if you're not into that, then you can always turn it off, but if you haven't played this yet, you need to do yourself a huge favor and try it out. If I'm being 100% honest, there really wasn't a lot of platformers that I played on the GBA. Most of my time was with the RPGs. And boy oh boy did the GBA have a lot of them, and it had 2 of my favorite RPGs of all time. The first being Golden Sun. Now, look, if you've been on this channel, then you'll know that I've talked about this game ad nauseum, be it how much I love it, or how badly I want my Golden Boy in Smash, or I'm still waiting for a 4th game, and as some of you know, I did an entire Golden Sun marathon on my channel about 2 years ago. So if you want to know about my full thoughts on the GBA game and on the series, then you should absolutely check them out. But for those of you not in the know, Golden Sun is probably the most accessible JRPG that I've ever played. Grinding is a complete non-issue, there's no overly complicated battle system, no over-dramatic story that makes no sense. I've said it before and I will say it again, this is a no bullshit RPG. It knows what it is and it does what it sets out to do. And it has a decent runtime too. First timers may take around 20 or so hours, but you can cut that time in half once when you're familiar with the game. Really, my biggest gripe with the game is that it feels like as if it's half the adventure. After you beat the final boss, the game teases at their next adventure and then the game just ends. And that's where the sequel, The Lost Stage, comes in. Again, for those of you not in the know, these two games were originally supposed to be one game, but then it got split in half because they couldn't fit everything inside one cartridge. The entirety of the first game takes place on a single continent, but the second game explores the rest of the world. And most of my praises towards the first game echoes the sequel. Both games have creative and fascinating dungeons. Exploring the world and solving puzzles with synergy was always satisfying. Finding and using the gym was a blast. Combat is flashy and fast-paced, the visuals are stunning, and the soundtrack is godly. I'll say it for people in the back who didn't quite catch that. These two games are the best sounding games on the GBA, and I have yet to be proven wrong. But you just can't talk about GBA RPGs without bringing up Pokemon. Pokemon Ruby specifically was a game that I sunk countless hours into, and is still by far my personal favorite Pokemon game. I mean, Pokemon Ruby, Pokemon Omega Ruby, just Hoenn in general is my favorite region. Gen 3 is my favorite generation, I guess, because that's the generation that I grew up with. And let's not forget that Pokemon Red and Blue got remixed with Fire Red and Leaf Green. I actually only ever played through this game recently with my friend, the Black Hooded Gamer. We streamed it on YouTube, it was a lot of fun, go check him out because this guy, he's something else, let me tell you what.
I'm saying that BJs sound like they suck.
They do! That's the whole point!
That sounds... Oh, fuck you.
When you're comparing the Gen 3 Pokemon games to the more recent games, I think it is fair to say that they're starting to show their age, but personally, I can play through these games just fine and have a good time. These games are a bit heavy on the grinding, more so in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but for my money, it's not a deal breaker. I also feel as if the pacing is much quicker when you compare the Gen 3 games to some of the more recent games. The battle transitions are quicker, the battles are snappier, it never felt as if the battles were a chore, or catching Pokemon was never a pain in the neck. And I especially appreciate how open-ended these games can be later on, as opposed to, again, the more recent games, which tend to be just a bit more linear. You can say that these games are dated, but I would say that they're still enjoyable and worth your time. You know, the GBA also had like a weirdly amount of strategy games, so if you were a fan of Final Fantasy Tactics or Shining Force, then Lord knows you're going to get your fill here. One tactics game in particular is a standout on the GBA, one that rejuvenated the franchise with its debut in the West. That's right, I'm talking about none other than the tactics games known as Advance Wars. I didn't play a lot of Fire Emblem. Here's an interesting tidbit about Advance Wars. People chalk up the success of Fire Emblem to Marth and Roy's inclusion in Melee, but it was also the success of Advance Wars in the West that told intelligent systems that there was demand for these kind of games. Unlike Fire Emblem, which takes itself seriously and has characters that you need to keep alive, Advance Wars has a more tongue-in-cheek approach. Brighter colors, exaggerated, more cartoonish character designs, a rockin' soundtrack. These two share a core gameplay component, but they really are two completely different games. Again, with Fire Emblem, you're encouraged to keep each unit alive. Each member of your team has some sort of value to them. But in Advance Wars, you can lose as many people as you need in order to secure your victory. If I'm being honest though, I've always preferred the Fire Emblem games more than the Wars games. I like the more intense and personal stories of Fire Emblem. Advance Wars feels more like as if I'm playing a board game rather than participating in an all-out war. I mean, either way, I still think Advance Wars is a great game, and I've heard nothing but great things about its sequel, and I'm thrilled to see this kind of gameplay come back with the likes of Wargrooves. See, Nintendo, there's still interest in this IP, so just, you know, you should probably give this series another go. Throw the Wars fans a fucking bone. Don't make everything about Fire Emblem. But maybe Advance Wars and Fire Emblem are just too simple, for lack of a better word. Maybe you need something just a bit more complicated, something that's difficult to learn and almost impossible to master. Well, that's where that's where okay, how the fuck do you even say this name?
Yugdra.
Oh, this This game just has so much going on. First of all, it's a strategy game like Fire Emblem, but this time you have cards. Each card that you has a number that dictates how many steps that you're able to take. You also have card-specific abilities, and another set of numbers that determine your attack power, and you also have this icon that shows which card will be most effective with a specific weapon. That right there was just the basics, because it adds more and more as the game goes on, and if I'm being honest, I have not met someone who has beaten this game, let alone someone who has even heard of this game before. At the same time, there's something weirdly satisfying about it. Games like this, games that tend to be overly complicated just for the sake of being complicated, they tend to turn me off, but this one is one that I actually kind of enjoy so far. I hear it gets brutal after a while, and in fairness, there is a PSP remake that tones down the difficulty. But from what I played, this is a pretty solid RPG, plus it has a great art style and a weirdly good soundtrack. This is a game that I want to play more of. I want to learn the ins and outs of this one because, again, there's something weirdly fun about this one. You know, now that I come to think about it, it was around like the mid-2000s where there was like a trend, there was like trading cards of everything. And maybe that's what inspired the card system in Yugdra Union, or however you're supposed to pronounce this, but even games like Kingdom Hearts and Mega Man caved into this trend. I think Chain of Memories has an excuse to have this kind of system, though. It would have been impossible to have a working battle system in the style of the first Kingdom Hearts game on the GBA. Honestly, I don't think this game is that bad. There's some sort of appeal to see the worlds from the PS2 game be demade into this. I didn't have a PS2 at the time when this game came out, and I remember that there were a lot of kids in my school who were obsessed with Kingdom Hearts. So this was my way of having some sort of Kingdom Hearts experience. Just, whatever you do, don't play Rechain. If you have to play any version of Chain of Memories, just play the original. But even then, I think you're better off just reading the manga. It saves you a lot more time that way. Now, as for Mega Man, I was introduced to the character through the Battle Network games, the third one specifically. At the time, I was familiar with the show, but I vaguely remember trading a pack of Gushers for this game around the 3rd grade, if I remember correctly. I wish I still had the game just so I could show it off, but, you know, emulation works wonders. What grabbed my attention as a kid was the art style. I always thought Mega Man and Proto Man looked so freaking cool, and even to this day, this rendition of Mega Man is my favorite. Probably piss someone off by saying that, but, you know, what can you do? The whole point of this game is that you send out an avatar to the internet and you fight viruses with data chips, which it might as well be trading cards. It's the same kind of thing. If you're a fan of the platform-heavy Mega Man games, then I can see you being turned off by this. But as its own thing, I think it's pretty cool. Honestly, I could be here all day talking about the games that I love on this thing. The point is that the GBA had a plethora of fantastic games it can easily lose hundreds of hours on. This was the last handheld to have the Game Boy brand before being overtaken by the Nintendo DS. With a library like this, it shouldn't surprise you that the GBA is easily one of my favorite consoles of all time. You know, it's kind of odd that despite the success of the Game Boy Advance, it had quite the short life cycle. This thing came out in 2001, and then the DS came out in 2004. Now, Nintendo swore on their lives saying that the Nintendo DS was going to act more of a pillar for the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube, that it's in no way, shape, or form going to replace the GBA, but we all know how that turned out. And granted, there were still games that came out in like 2004, 5, and 6, but at that point, people were flocking over to Nintendo's newest shiny little toy. But what I think about this thing right here, that's going to be another topic for another time. But with that said, I would also like to ask you guys a quick question. No, maybe not quick, but you'll get the gist of it. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do for a while, but I could just never get a good script down. But hey, you know, I finally uploaded the video. That's great. So I just want to know, what are some things that I can do to improve? Is this something that you would want to see more of? Like, if you want to see me cover the Nintendo DS or the GameCube or anything like that for that matter. If there's anything you'd like to see me covered, just let me know, but also give me some feedback, you know, whether or not I talked about a certain game or a certain topic for too long, or maybe if I dragged something out. Any kind of feedback I would greatly appreciate. But lastly, before we wrap things up here, let's get a discussion rolling. What are some of your favorite games on the GBA? Maybe there's a game that you played but not a lot of people have played and you just want to give us some attention, some love and recognition. Maybe you have like a specific memory with the GBA. If you have anything to say about it, feel free to post in the comment section down below. Let's get a discussion rolling. But either way, my name is Ryan. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a fantastic day today.
That's a big ass fucking spider. Let me get my shoe. But fuck spiders. They stank as hell.